All right, party people. Uh, this video is intended to um, go over some of the background material that you have to understand um, in order to have a clearer understanding of what's going on with COVID. Okay, so there's a lot of resources for you to read or listen to or watch that are specific to COVID that are not me talking. I have found a ton of cool things on the web. I have made an outline of questions that I think you should be able to answer. And I'm just going to let you do your thing. Okay. But I do want to give you a bit of a lecture on this background stuff. Since you have a lot of COVID things to read and engage with, I'm going to try to keep this pretty short. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on sort of three topics that are, like I said, information that you need to know to appreciate COVID. Okay, so the first one is what are viruses anyway, right? We need to talk about that. And while we're at it, we're going to talk about some other not viruses that kind of act like viruses and part of that story. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to talk about for a couple minutes. Then I'm going to give you like the quick and dirty overview of the immune system. Okay, so we are certainly not getting into any of the details, but you have to understand a little bit about how the immune system functions in order to understand how vaccines work, and in order to understand why COVID is such a big deal. Okay, especially since vaccines will be rolling out soon, right? Depending on when you're watching this video, they might have already been rolling out. Okay, it's good to have some understanding of like, what is a vaccine, what do they do, right? Before you start thinking about a COVID specific vaccine. Okay, so let's carry on. So let's start with what a virus is. So one of my friends who also teaches biology likes to say that viruses are like M&Ms. It's a chunk of DNA or RNA, so nucleic acid, covered by a protein coat called a capsid. Okay, so like an M&M, right? Chocolate with a candy shell. Anyway, one of the things that is going to be important when learning about both COVID, but just like vaccines in general, is one other component of the capsid. Many viruses have these little protrusions on them called recognition spikes, okay? Or some people call them spike proteins, okay? And those are unique to different types of viruses, okay? So that's the basic anatomy of a virus. One of the things that you will notice about this, or you should notice about this, is viruses are specifically not made of cells, right? They are not made of cells. They don't have any organelles. They don't have a plasma membrane. They don't have any of the parts that cells have, right? They literally are a nucleic acid, whether it's DNA or RNA, covered in this little protein coat. Okay, and that's it. Sorry, that was a long enough interruption that I don't remember where I left off. I think I was beginning to talk about whether or not viruses are alive. So what I said was, you'll notice that it's not a cell, right? It doesn't have any cell parts. It's not, right? It's literally just nucleic acid with like a shell called a capsid. Okay, it's essentially a protein coat. Okay. All right, fair enough. So let's go all the way back to chapter 1, right? And think about, what are the required characteristics for life? Well, several of these viruses do meet. Others of these, they do not. Okay, so they're not made of cells. And one of the requirements for life is that living things are made of one or more cells. Okay. Another requirement of life that cells do not meet is they don't have any mechanism by which they transform energy. So they don't do cellular respiration. They don't do photosynthesis. They don't do fermentation. They don't eat. They don't have a metabolism, right? They don't do anything like that. For that matter, they don't do anything on their own. Okay. They cannot reproduce on their own. Now, this is kind of a gray area because viruses are amazing at reproduction, but the only way they can do it is by hijacking a cell, and they use the machinery of a cell, of a host cell, in order to reproduce. Okay, so reproduction was one of the requirements of life that viruses kind of meet. They can't reproduce on their own. They have to hijack a host cell, okay? Because they don't have any of the machinery necessary to make new virus parts. They don't have any of the organelles necessary to make new nucleic acids or make new proteins. They don't have any of that machinery because they literally are just nucleic acid in a protein coat. One characteristic of living things that viruses do have is the ability to evolve, okay? This is the reason why you are supposed to get a flu shot every year, okay? The reason you're supposed to get a flu shot every year is the flu virus happens to be a virus that mutates very, very quickly and easily. And so every flu season, every year or so, there are different strains or different versions of the flu that are out and about, okay? And so the goal of the flu vaccine each year is the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, tries to guess which flu viruses, which of the different variations of it, are going to be a problem that year. Okay, and they do that by looking at other countries, right? Which flu viruses are a problem in other countries during their flu season, okay? And they come up with a guess, right? And so they put 3 or 4 different vaccines. Each vaccine for each year is composed of essentially a combination of vaccines for 3 or 4 different strains of the flu virus. Sometimes the CDC guesses wrong and people get the flu anyway, okay? But the flu vaccine highly reduces the number of people that get the flu every year. And it would be even more effective if more people would get the flu vaccine every year, okay? But more about, like, I don't want to go down that road of vaccines yet because we have to talk more about some other things before we get to that, okay? So that's kind of the deal with viruses, all right? So sort of the technical opinion of biology is that viruses really aren't technically alive, right? Because they're not made of cells. They don't do any kind of energy transformation. Right? And they are only made of 2 parts, okay? However, so I'm going to put a star here because this is kind of on both sides, can reproduce, but only within host cell. Okay, and they do evolve. Okay, so anyway, so that's kind of the deal with viruses, right? So one of my favorite stories to tell is I have a couple of friends who are both biology professors that are married to each other. And there's this great story about how one time there was a bunch of us, friends from work and, things that were hanging out, having a party. Like, I don't even remember if it was a holiday or just, a random Friday, whatever. And they got into this argument about whether or not viruses should be considered alive. It was pretty funny. This is the kind of stuff that only happens at nerd parties, man. It was good times. So anyway, and they got all, and then, everybody gets irritated with me because I'm like, I don't know. I sit on the fence, man. I'm not picking a side, yes or no. Okay. But it's important that you understand why some people, well, like I said, the official word on the street is that they are not alive. Okay, so the official answer is no, but they do have some characteristics that are similar to living things. So some people consider them to be alive. Anyway, okay. So that's what a virus is, all right? Another interesting thing to know about viruses is that there are gazillions, yes, that's a technical number, of different types of viruses, and they infect all different kinds of organisms. So you're probably used to hearing about viruses like the flu virus and, you know, and measles and Ebola and HIV, and all of the examples that are in your book are mostly, they're focusing on viruses that affect humans. But there are viruses that literally can infect any type of cell, right? So these guys right here, those are a class of viruses called a bacteriophage, and they infect bacteria, which is kind of bonkers, right? Because it's like bacteria are already super small, simple cells, and there's a virus that infects them. Yes, there is. Okay. These are all examples of different viruses that infect humans. So there's a coronavirus here. Which more about that in a second. There's HIV here and Ebola. Okay. And there's others in your book if you want to see some other images. Viruses infect plants too. So there's some cool little, you know, examples of viruses that infect plants. So this particular one right here, it's called tobacco mosaic virus, but there are viruses that infect roses and all different kinds of plants. And so if you ever see flowers that have like a streaky appearance where it looks like the petals are like one color, but it has like streaks of another color, that's caused by a virus that turns out to be very pretty. Okay. But a virus, right? So roses can be infected with that type of virus. Tulips as well can have that kind of streaky appearance. I got some bell peppers the other day that had this like streaky color pattern that was really kind of cool and funky. They were like red and yellow at the same time and streaky. That's caused by a virus. Okay. One important thing to realize is that viruses are generally fairly host specific, not perfectly necessarily. They can jump from one host to another occasionally. But, you know, if you're thinking, oh my God, I have one of those rose plants, I better kill it before I get sick from it. Plant viruses can't make people sick. Okay. That's a jump too far. Same with bacteriophages. They infect bacteria. They don't affect humans. Okay. So there's lots of different types of viruses is what I'm getting at. Okay. You need to understand viruses to understand COVID-19, the coronavirus that we're talking about. Okay. Since we're talking about this is a little bit of a tangent, but I also thought we would talk about viroids and prions. Okay. So a viroid, what that is it's even simpler than a virus. It's basically like if you just have that little, you know, swatch of nucleic acid and it doesn't even really have an official protein coat. That's a viroid. Essentially, it's the same as virus, though, so we're not going to make a distinction. Okay. Prions, on the other hand, are fascinating. Okay. So prions are actually a protein. Whoa, that arrow did not look good. I'm going to describe them as an infectious misfolded protein. Okay, so remember back from earlier when we were in chapter 2, and we were talking about how much this idea that form follows function, right? The shape of something is very important for how it works. And that's very true of proteins, right? Proteins have to fold into a specific structure in order to be functional. Okay, so if a protein is folded incorrectly, it's not going to work the way it's supposed to. Okay. What's really, really interesting about prions is that they essentially are contagious. Okay. And others. All right. So this particular one I think this actually is not Kuru. This is from your book. It's an image that they're using to represent KJS, Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, which is a fancy name that you don't need to know. Okay, but it is a prion disease. Okay, Kuru is another one. We'll talk about it in just a second. Essentially, there's a whole class of them, and they have a bunch of examples in your book. It's actually really, the coverage is good of this. So here we have a normal shaped protein. They're just using like random symbols. Okay, so the normal is supposed to be like a hexagon shape, right? And then the abnormal is shaped like that little piece from Tetris. Okay, if you don't know how to play Tetris, I'm sorry. I'm a child of I'm a tween and teen of the 90s. Okay, all right. So that little shape. Okay, the thing that's weird about prion disorders is that the abnormally folded proteins cause other proteins to change their shape too. So this guy is going to make this guy change shape, and they kind of like link together, right? This guy is making this guy change shape, and then they link together, right? And so the idea is that you have this buildup over time of more and more of these messed up proteins instead of the normal proteins. Okay. I want to say it might not be all, but in many, if not all, of the prion related diseases that we know about, they primarily affect brain tissue. Okay. And so the first prion disease that I think it's the first that people became familiar with is something called Kuru. Kuru was a condition that developed in Papua New Guinea. Okay. And so there were these native folks there that they developed this really interesting disease that it started to run rampant through their community, and other people didn't get it. People who were visiting them and trying to study and trying to help them, right, to try to figure out what the cause of the disease was. Other people weren't getting it, and they couldn't figure out what it was and what it was that was making them sick, right? Is it a virus? Is it a bacterial infection? What's happening? Is it something genetic? Like they couldn't figure it out until they started looking at the culture of these people. And so in this group, one of the cultural practices that to us sounds a little like weird, perhaps, because this is not something that you're used to, but was something that they had done for years and years and years, was ritualized cannibalism, right? So the idea is that if a loved one, somebody in your tribe, right, somebody in your community dies, one way of honoring them is by ingesting their flesh, right, as their life force, right? So like a passing on of their life force. So, what do I want to say about this? Okay. Some of you were having that reaction of being like, oh, gross, right? But if you think about it, this is meant to be a very sort of respectful, and in some cases it sort of like makes sense in a way. I'm not saying that, I'm condoning this activity because it's problematic because of this, right? But it does kind of make sense, right? You're honoring somebody by taking a part of them with you. Okay. And so what was happening is it turned out that these people in this community had this disease that they called Kuru. And what it did is it affected their brains. And so brains, these are pictures of brains. Okay. And so what was happening is it's caused by a prion, right? And what was happening is when somebody would consume the flesh of, their relative, right, or their family member who had this, they would become infected with it, right? And over time, they would gradually sort of like go crazy, okay, and then die. right? And the reason that it was only common within the members of the community is they were the only ones who were practicing the ritualized cannibalism. Eventually they figured out what it was, right? And it was like, okay, you guys can't do this anymore because it's the reason why people are dying, right? Is this, the practice of cannibalism. And so they stopped doing it. And now it's not an issue. Okay. One of the things that's really interested about prions is that unlike other types of infectious agents, it's not killed by heat. Well, first of all, is it even alive? We have the same argument that we had about viruses. Is a prion alive? Well, it's just a protein. It's not even a cell. So can we continue it to be alive? Can we continue? Can we consider it to be alive? I don't know. Can we? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. Probably not. Right. But it does reproduce in a way by inducing other proteins to be the wrong shape too. So, so this is another one of those things that's kind of on the line. Okay. The interesting thing about prion diseases is because they're caused by just a protein, heat does not kill them. So, and for that matter, we don't have any treatments to treat them. So the only way to avoid getting prion diseases is prevention, right? There is no cure. Okay. How do you change a wrong folding protein from making another protein, change to fold wrong? Right? We don't have treatments for this. Okay. And so your book talks about a couple of other sort of variants of prion diseases in other animals. So sheep and goats get something called scrappy. In cattle, they can get something called mad cow disease. It was a while ago now, probably before most of you were alive. There was an outbreak of mad cow in Britain. And they ended up having to cull or euthanize like herds and herds and herds of cattle that were, being raised for beef because they were infected and they had no way of stopping the infection. And you can't, right? Because you can't kill it with heat. It's not like something where it's like, oh, there's an E. coli infection and, you got to cook your meat thoroughly enough, right? You can't cook your meat thoroughly enough, right, for prion infections. So that's why there's a picture of a cow in a, whatever those are called, front loader. I don't know. Anyway, in that device, because it died. It died of the mad cow. Right. So they just have to be disposed of. And that was a pretty scary thing for a while. Everybody was like, we're not going to eat beef, because everybody was super worried about mad cow because there is no treatment. And so when mad cow jumps into people, we call it Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Okay. So your book talks about that a little bit. There's also a version of this that's in elk and deer and moose populations in North America, called chronic wasting disease. And it's the same kind of thing. It's a prion disorder. And so a lot of people in the US are really concerned about not wanting to eat venison, right? Deer or elk that are killed by hunters and then, prepared and they bring home to feed their family, because they can be infected with this chronic wasting disease, which can jump to humans as well. Right. And so, so for the time being, my recommendation would be don't eat elk. If your neighbor, your friend, family member likes to hunt elk, skip it. The next time they're trying to feed it to you, just skip it. Farmed venison seems to be safe right now because it's, they're catching it, they're checking the health of the animals. But, when people are hunting, they don't necessarily know about the health of the animals, right? And they don't necessarily know about the health of the population. Okay. So anyway, so that's a prion. So like I said, it's not a virus. It's a different thing. It's kind of a fun tangent to talk about here though. Okay. So anyway, I actually, Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Okay. And then I'm going to continue the PowerPoint with the second video. Okay. See, you'd think by now that I would know what I'm doing, but I don't. Stop recording. Yes,